Welcome back. In this session, I'm continuing to look at some of the main themes in the Old Testament. And here I want to focus particularly on creation. Now, this is something I've given a good deal of time to over the years and written quite a bit about, and it deserves much longer treatment than I can give it here. But I hope I can cover some of the main points. For anyone who wants to explore these things further, I'm happy to pass on details of some of the other things I've written. Some of this discussion, especially around whether biblical creation accounts should be taken literally or not, is, I appreciate, controversial. And Christians express very different views. I'll be setting out mine, and I hope you'll bear with me as I explore some of the key aspects of this difficult but important subject. Let's look first at accounts of creation. The clearest picture of God as creator in the Old Testament is in Genesis 1 and 2, though there are several other references. The most significant are the passages that are listed there: Job, Psalms, Isaiah, and Jeremiah. Some of these, as we've already seen, distinguish God as creator from others who claim to be gods, but are nothing more than worthless idols. Now, one of the things to say about these accounts of creation is that they're not trying to give a scientific account of what happened. The word that is sometimes used here is myth. Now, that doesn't mean that the accounts are not true. Rather, a myth seeks to explain truths about God and the world in non-scientific terms, using language and imagery that their first audience would have understood. And while these passages do appear to use mythological language, the stories are true in the sense that they convey the meaning and significance of what is described. And it's that meaning and significance which is sometimes overlooked in the debate about whether or not the account should be taken literally that I want to focus on. I appreciate, as I said, that this is controversial. I fully believe that God could have created the world in 6 literal days. For me, though, the main issue here is the theological significance of these stories. And I want to leave those other debates to one side as I focus on those theological issues. There are other ancient Near Eastern creation accounts. 2 in particular would have been familiar to the Old Testament writers and their audience. And sometimes the language is similar. These are Enuma Elish from Babylon and Baal and the Sea from Ugarit, which is just north of Israel. Let me emphasize, though, that the Old Testament writers never accept the belief systems that go with these other accounts. They may use similar language, but they don't believe the same things. And in many cases, the Old Testament accounts challenge those religious ideas. One of the main differences is that whilst in those other accounts we have several gods all vying for power, in the Old Testament, as we have emphasized, there is only one God with no rivals. One of the features of these accounts is that the world begins as a watery chaos, where the waters are represented by sea monsters. These chaos monsters are defeated by the creator God, and creation takes place. Frequently, too, the creator God is elevated to chief among the gods. So in Enuma Elish, Marduk, the god of Babylon, defeats Tiamat, who represents the sea, and divides her body to make heaven and earth. In Baal and the Sea, Baal defeats the sea, Yam. Now, it has been suggested that Baal and the Sea is not strictly a creation account, but there are creation elements in it. One is that the result of Baal's victory is that well-being is poured out on the earth. Let me show this in a diagram. Now, I don't want to press the similarities too far, but we see this same kind of imagery in the Old Testament too. In Psalm 74, 13 and 14, it was you who split open the sea by your power. You broke the heads of the monster in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan. In Job 26, verses 10 to 13. He marks out the horizon on the face of the waters for a boundary between light and darkness. The pillars of the heavens quake, aghast at his rebuke. By his power, he churned up the sea. By his wisdom, he cut Rahab to pieces. By his breath, the skies became fair. His hand pierced the gliding serpent. Now, Leviathan is also mentioned in Isaiah 27, verse 1. In that day, the Lord will punish with his sword Leviathan, the gliding serpent, Leviathan, the coiling serpent. He will slay the monster of the sea. Now, this is very similar to something we see in Baal and the Sea, which describes Lotan, which may be another name for Yam, as the fleeing serpent, the twisting serpent, the close coiling one with 7 heads. The names Lotan and Leviathan are similar enough to suggest a link between them. And we see here too reference to multiple heads, as in Psalm 74:14. Now, why is this important? Well, for 2 reasons. First, because it changes the narrative. The world was not created by Marduk or any other god. It was created by Yahweh. And as I've said, some of these Old Testament stories may be deliberately aimed at challenging the claims of these other gods. The second thing is that it emphasizes Yahweh's power over the whole of creation. He made it and he controls it. And that doesn't just apply to nature. God's victory at creation was also reapplied by Old Testament writers to Israel's history and to their historical enemies. Now, one of the most obvious historical connections is between the primeval waters and the Red Sea. We see that, for example, in Isaiah 51:9 and 10. Was it not you who cut Rahab to pieces, who pierced that monster through? Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made a road in the depths of the sea so that the redeemed might cross over? Here, references to Rahab and to the great deep point to creation, whilst making a road in the sea for the redeemed to cross over refers to the Red Sea and the Exodus. Now, this emphasizes that the power at work in creation was the same power at work in the deliverance from Egypt. Here's another representation of how we might view Isaiah 51:9 to 11. And the result of this is a new beginning for God's people. And that is significant. God is the creator of the world, but he is also Israel's creator. But it's important too to see that these verses don't only look back at creation and at the Exodus. They were written to people in exile, and they look forward to their return in what we have already described as a second and more glorious Exodus. And that new Exodus will result in a new creation, new heavens and a new earth. Now, I've suggested that a key theme in the Pentateuch is that while God transformed primeval chaos, which is described as tohu vabohu, into something very good, human sin might allow that chaos to return. And in Jeremiah 4:23, when the prophet describes the state of the world just before the exile, he uses exactly the same language, tohu vabohu. And the language in the next few verses, verses 24 and 25, seems to suggest creation kind of going into reverse. The coming exile then is viewed as a return to chaos. But the God who transformed chaos into order in the beginning can do it again. And that gives his people hope. Now, as I've said, this theme of God's victory over chaos also demonstrates God's power over the nations that oppose his people. So in Psalm 46, the roaring waters in verse 3 become the roaring nations in verse 6. All of these subject to God's control. Elsewhere, those enemies are likened to chaos monsters. Egypt is referred to as Rahab and as a sea monster. The Hebrew word there is tannin, and it's sometimes translated dragon or serpent. The king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, is also likened to a tannin, a sea monster. But Babylon too will be defeated. Her sea will be dried up. We mentioned already Yahweh's defeat of Leviathan in Isaiah 27:1. Now, Leviathan here may represent a current enemy, though probably it points to Yahweh's final victory over all human power that opposes him. His victory over creation then is brought into the present. There are still threats to the life and faith of God's people, but they too will be defeated. And that victory is then projected into the future. The battle that led to creation and the defeat of chaos will be repeated and will lead to the final overthrow of evil and the promise of a new creation. In this way, it has significance for the past, for the present, and for the future. Now, whilst on this subject, let me raise an important question. What was there in the beginning? Now, there is a view that there was an initial creation in Genesis 1:1, but that was followed by rebellion in heaven, and the cosmic battle there resulted in the earth becoming formless and empty. And that's what we find in Genesis 1:2. This is sometimes called the gap theory because it leaves a gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. Now, that view is popular in some circles, but it is almost certainly not what happened. But that still leaves the question, what was there in the beginning? Was it nothing? Or was there this watery chaos? And the answer is both. Let me try to explain what I mean by that. See, in my view, Genesis 1:1 and 2 sets two ideas alongside each other. One is the traditional understanding. In the beginning, there was only God, and he brought everything else into existence. That is an important Old Testament theme. God and God only is eternal. And that emphasizes the transcendence of God. He exists independently of the created order. He is above it and he is beyond it. Now, this is in marked contrast to the way some other nations often worshipped aspects of creation, the sun, the moon, and so on. In the biblical account, these are simply part of God's creation. And that transcendence is also seen in the way, in the Genesis account, God brought everything into existence with just a word. God said, and it was so. We also see that idea of creation by God's word of command in these other passages too. Psalm 33, 6 and 9, and Psalm 148, 5 and 6. Now, it's also worth noting that the word for to create, bara, in the Genesis account is only ever used in the Old Testament with God as the subject. This is something that God and God alone does. Now, that further emphasizes the distinction between him and those that others that claim to be gods. But it's also significant that bara is used not just for God's creation of the world, but for his creation of Israel as his own people. Now, alongside God's transcendence, as we have seen, creation is also presented as a process in which God transforms chaos. Now, that allows for the possible return of chaos as a result of human sin, and it also points to God's continued presence and activity in the world, what is sometimes called his immanence. He is and continues to be intimately involved with his creation. He orders the seasons. He provides water and makes the grass grow. Israel's prosperity in the promised land depends on God's continual care And as we have seen, sin can disrupt that, leading to eventual exile from the land. But even though sin has an impact on God's world, God can still be relied upon as the one who brings order out of chaos, light out of darkness, and hope out of despair. And that too is an important Old Testament theme. And these two ideas of God's transcendence and God's immanence, God as eternal, but God transforming chaos, need to be held together. We can't reconcile them, but both of them are important. Now, one further thing we see here is the role of God's Spirit. In Genesis 1:2, the Spirit was hovering over the waters. This seems to suggest some kind of divine control prior to God's creative action. And we see something similar in Genesis 6:3. The New International Version translates that verse, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever," though a better translation is, "My spirit will not abide with humans forever." As we've already seen, the Spirit is grieved by human sin. And here, sin results in the withdrawal of God's Spirit. And that in turn opens the way for the waters, which had been held in check, to return. Now, there may be a further link to the Spirit's involvement in creation in Job 26:12 and 13, which could be translated, "By his Spirit the skies became fair, his hand pierced the gliding serpent." Psalm 104:29 and 30 also links God's Spirit with creation. "When you hide your face, they are terrified. When you take away their breath, ruach, they die and return to the dust. When you send your Spirit, ruach, they are created, and you renew the face of the earth." The emphasis here, though, is not so much on that first act of creation, but rather creation's ongoing dependence on God's provision. And that ongoing dependence includes the breath that is needed to create and sustain life. And as we have noted, that giving of breath is associated with the Spirit. We've already mentioned Ezekiel's valley of dry bones, where first the bones come together and tendons, flesh, and skin cover them, but they only come to life when breath, ruach, enters them. Now, we'll say more about this shortly when we think about the creation of human beings. For the moment, though, let me say again that it is this divine breath that enables human existence, and that is associated with the Spirit. Now, as we think about creation, let me mention briefly how the Bible writers appear to have viewed the universe. As I've said, the Old Testament describes the universe in non-scientific terms. In the Old Testament account, the earth and sea is surrounded by a solid expanse, sky. And that sky holds back the waters above it. But there are floodgates that can be opened to allow the waters to come through. There are also waters under the earth. The sun, moon, and stars are set in the sky. Now, that's not how we think of the heavens, but it was a common view in the ancient world. The Old Testament also refers to the foundations of the earth, and the place of the dead, Sheol, is located in the depths of the earth. Now, this very stylized illustration is taken from my Old Testament theology book. But again, this is quite a different picture from the one that we know from modern science. And this is another reason for not taking the Old Testament accounts of creation as literal descriptions of how it all happened. Let me set out those things again, but with the scripture references that you can check up on to emphasize those particular aspects of it. But while the creation of heavens and earth is important, and it emphasizes God's care for and his commitment to the created order. A key aspect of that narrative is the creation of human beings. Human beings are seen as the pinnacle of God's creation. Psalm 8 refers to God's work in creation and goes on to talk about human beings. You have made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. You made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet. And in Genesis 1, we see that after each stage of creation, God saw that what he had made was good. After the creation of human beings, which concluded that initial work of creation, everything was declared to be very good in Genesis 1:31. Now, when we look at the creation of human beings, we see that they're made from the dust of the ground in Genesis 2:7, which indicates that they are part of the created order. And they're described as well as having the breath of life, which, as we have seen, animates human flesh. What we also see in that verse, that it is the combination of flesh with God's breath that results in the creation of a living being. The Hebrew word for that is nephesh. It occurs frequently in the Old Testament and is often translated soul, though that translation is misleading. For Christians, the soul is the essential part of who we are. It will survive the death of the body and will go to be with God. In the Old Testament, the nephesh cannot be separated. It is not something human beings possess, it is what they are. And where it appears in the Old Testament, my soul is another way of saying me. And when God withdraws his breath and the body dies, the nephesh ceases to exist. What does survive is a shadowy representation of the whole person in Sheol, the place of the dead. But this is not afterlife as we understand it, though there are hints of something better. And I'll say more about that when we come to talk about future hope. Moving back then to thinking about creation, some see having the breath of life as something that makes human beings distinct from the rest of creation, though the same expression is used in relation to other living creatures. It is uniquely breathed into human beings by God, so there may be something in that. But what seems to be more decisive in emphasizing the distinctiveness of human beings is that we, are made in the image of God. Now, the Old Testament does not explain what this means. It almost certainly does not mean that human beings look like God. We've already seen that God is spiritual and he cannot be represented by any physical part of creation, including human beings. It does suggest, though, that we share some characteristics with God. Now, this may include things like personality, intelligence, free will, maybe creativity. But who makes that decision? And the problem here is that when people make lists of that kind, they are likely to include qualities that fit them and their group. And that can then become the basis for looking down on and devaluing others who do not share those same characteristics. And that kind of thing can be used to justify racism and atrocities against other ethnic groups, as well as mistreatment of those with physical and mental disabilities. In some sense, they are not made in the image of God the way we are. And that seems to me a wholly unacceptable way of understanding this. The only indication from the text is that to be made in the image of God has something to do with ruling on his behalf. Genesis 1:26 seems to set out two parallel ideas. Let us make humankind in our image and let them rule over all the creatures that move along the ground. That's also what we see in Psalm 8 6 to 8. Human beings are made to represent God. He has given them, us, authority and responsibility to rule over his world on his behalf. That, though, does imply exercising care and responsibility. This is not a license to exploit the world and its resources. Now, associated with this special calling, human beings are crowned with glory and honor. Psalm 8, verse 5. We are made in the image of God to rule as God's representatives and to reflect the glory of God within his world. And it's important to recognize too that this special calling is shared by both male and female. God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. He created them. Now, the creation of human beings in Genesis 1 has sometimes been used to suggest that women are somehow inferior to men. Now, I appreciate that Paul says something to that effect too in his first letter to Timothy, though he may be addressing a local issue regarding women teaching, and is using the kind of argument that was common amongst Jewish rabbis at the time, but might not be so valid in a different context. The emphasis of Genesis 1:26, though, is that both male and female share equally in the high calling that human beings have received. The account of the fall of human beings in Genesis 3 also puts much of the blame on Eve, and again emphasizes Adam's superiority. However, it might not be quite so straightforward as that. In that account in Genesis 3, Eve is presented as being much more assertive and decisive than Adam. Certainly, she is the one who disobeys, and she drew Adam into her sin. But where was Adam while all this was happening? And why did he offer no resistance? Adam here is presented as passive, almost characterless, and that seems significant. Men, as I've already mentioned, were generally dominant within Israelite society, and the Old Testament reflects that patriarchal perspective. And some argue that within that context, women have a raw deal. Now, it seems very unlikely that Genesis 3 intends to challenge that way of looking at the world. However, to present Adam, the one who should be taking the lead and asserting male dominance, the one who is the father of the human race, presenting him as one who is relatively weak, passive, and almost irresponsible, seems to be a contradiction. And it raises doubts about Adam's suitability for the role assigned to him. So rather than presenting Eve as all bad and Adam as the one led astray, the way the narrator presents this particular story suggests that both are to blame, that both failed to fulfill the role for which God created them. Now, I perhaps need to add here, in today's world where gender seems more fluid, that the Old Testament is written against a particular cultural background. A key part of creating male and female is procreation. And in that setting, and within the world of the Old Testament in general, wider issues were not discussed. And I'm loath to use the text to try to answer questions that the writers never thought to ask. But let me return briefly to the conversation between Eve and the serpent as the narrator presents it to us, and the nature of the servant's temptation. The first thing the servant does here is to raise a question in Eve's mind about what God has said, and temptation often takes that kind of form. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? And Eve's response is presented by the narrator as giving an insight into her state of mind and suggesting that she was already feeling dissatisfied and disaffected. And so her answer emphasizes what God has said they can't do. She points to God's prohibition, and she also minimizes the abundant provision that God has made for them. And that's presented by the narrator in this way. First, she omits the word any from her response. God had forbidden them to eat the fruit of just one tree. They could take their pick from any of the others. But Eve doesn't emphasize that. Her reply is much more downbeat. We may eat the fruit from the trees of the garden. And then what she does is to emphasize and exaggerate what they can't do. But God did say, you must not eat from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die. Now, the original command made no reference to touching the fruit, but that's how Eve was thinking. And without wanting to read too much into the story, maybe it was because she was already thinking that way that she was the serpent's target. But in the light of that temptation, that on eating the fruit that your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil, it was all too much to resist. But what does it mean to know good and evil? And how does that make human beings like God? Now, of course, this could simply mean the ability to distinguish between right and wrong. But that would mean that before eating the fruit, Adam and Eve didn't know the difference. They didn't know that what they were doing was wrong, so they couldn't really be held accountable for it. It could mean that before eating the fruit, they knew the difference between right and wrong, but then until that point, they had no experience of doing wrong. But that doesn't fit well with the idea of becoming like God, because God has no experience of doing wrong. Now, I think another explanation fits the context and the verse better. Now, one thing to note here is that the terms good and evil do not necessarily imply things that are morally good or bad. It may simply mean what is good or bad for me. And understanding these things that way, by eating the fruit, Adam and Eve came to know for themselves what was beneficial and harmful. And by doing that, they could break free of their dependence on God and take control of their own destiny. And it's in that sense that they would be like God. That action, though, has consequences. And here we see what is often described as the fall of the human race. Now, one result of that is death. Now, the death that is talked about in Genesis must include mortality. Human beings would eventually die. Now, that wouldn't be felt immediately. Adam is recorded as living to the ripe old age of 930. So perhaps more important here is the spiritual dimension, the loss of the close relationship with God that had been there before. And here we see an important principle. When God's people choose to live without him, they revert to what they were without him. As we've already seen, God in creation transformed chaos, but human sin allows it, at least in part, to return. Here in Genesis 3, we see that human beings who were made from the dust, when they choose to live lives independently of God, they'll revert to the dust. Another consequence of the fall is the cursing of the ground. And in my view, there is a very close relationship between the cursing of the ground and the return of chaos. And this fall is something that will affect all human beings from then on. It is perhaps telling that in Genesis 5:1-3, after reminding us that Adam was made in the likeness of God, we're told that he had a son who was in his own likeness, in his own image. See, the whole human race is caught up in this. And throughout the Old Testament, there is the recognition that things are not as they should be. And there is the hope of something better. And that hope is there because God remains committed to his creation. We see that in the preservation of Noah and of his family during the flood. We see it in the call of Abraham in Genesis 12. We see it in the promise of a new creation. Now, we'll say more about that commitment when we look at the subject of covenant in the next session. And I hope to see you then. Thanks again for listening.